Hello and welcome to the CDAO magazine interview series. I'm Jake Dreier with Hilabs, and we are partnering with CDAO magazine and MIT CDAO IQ and the International Society of Chief Data Officers in an interview series. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Zoher Karu, who is the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at Blue Shield of California. Zoher, welcome.
Thank you, Jake.
What are the ways that you are using data analytics to influence the cost of care, lowering the costs, while at the same time making sure that the quality of the care experience for patient isn't impacted? It's a little bit of a balancing act, and so I'd love to hear how you can use data analytics to actually, again, increase quality while lowering those costs from a data standpoint.
Right. So you're right that it definitely is a balancing act. You can decrease costs by providing no care, for example. That would not lead to good outcomes for everybody. I think that it really, boils down to kind of a two-step process. You can do some very gross level understanding of how to reduce the cost of care by looking at big averages of what's going on with MRIs in hospitals and how do we reduce that cost, et cetera. But so you can do some big swags at it. That's sort of the basics, get that out of the way. But then the real trick in my mind to uncovering value in the cost of healthcare is back to the same philosophy of variability is opportunity, right? Not every provider is the same, not every hospital is the same. So how do you understand where these pockets of outliers, if you will, seem to be coming from? And it might be some behavioral change needed on behalf of the provider. It might need some education needed in the community for that specific population set that's nearby. We don't know what the answer is, but you first have to put your finger on, like, this is the average cost of an MRI, but guess what? It varies from, this to this, and what's going on with these people and what's different about these people because it's the same essential service, right? And so what is actually happening, and try to pinpoint these outliers, and then those outliers usually lead to some actions, right? So trying to, looking at the variability, slicing it by different dimensions, looking at it by geography, looking at it by tenure of doctor, or looking at it by the type of member who is served, or the age of the member, or whatever, like just slicing and say, is there something that when you put it all together, you see a big average, and it may look fine from an average perspective, but underneath there's such a spread that there's some opportunity there to make a change. And whenever you are doing any of these things, it is important that cost only is not the only objective function, right? There are multiple constraints. It's, cost and quality, and there are different ways of getting quality measures, but that combination is what you're trying to look for. And so, you could decrease one or the other, but they move in parallel, as you said, or conjunction. And so you could combine them and then look for the outliers in the combination of the two, right? Like, where do I have kind of both high cost and low quality, like what something is going on, right? And so that is really the challenge and the opportunity to do it. This whole variability is opportunity concept, and really, honestly, having a curious mindset and not just accepting the totals and the averages, right? But really understanding, what if I broke that down? What if I looked at that by time of day? What if I look at, and so, one part of being a successful, I think, analytics person is having that curious mindset and not just waiting for the phone to ring and saying, okay, I just want somebody to ask me a question so then I can go off and answer it, but really being proactive and trying to unearth those different opportunities that can help drive business outcomes, because nobody may have thought to ask that question, but you thought to look at it, right? And so it is really about, like, if I had to summarize it, like, if you were an analytics person and you got no emails and no phone calls and no anything else, and you went to work, would you know what to do that day? That's the way I think about it, right? And so, do you know what to do to help uncover and drive value without somebody asking you for something, right? And so that, I think, is a key part of it. And we're also caught up in our day-to-day work. We have to create time to allow that thinking to occur. And so that's through automation, through data democratization, through other things that can get that and free up that mind space to be able to think about these types of problems, I think is critical.
Mhm. I really like how you have framed data science as an art, right? You need this curiosity, you need this ability to think creatively. I think that's a really important sort of North Star to stay anchored with, especially as we're seeing data science evolve so rapidly. And I want to go back to something we mentioned before, which in that vein is artificial intelligence and machine learning. We are seeing those use cases pop up all across the healthcare industry, and they're all promising transformational results. And so I'd love to hear from you, how does you and your team know which solutions to explore and prioritize while making sure that data science remains this art form full of curiosity, as you mentioned before?
So, the prioritization the prioritization problem is one of the biggest problems, right? It's the problem isn't necessarily how do I solve this, because there are a lot of methods and approaches to it. There are hard problems, of course, but largely one of the bigger problems is prioritizing. And that prioritization needs to come through continuous dialogue with all of the business stakeholders that we interact with, right? And to understand what is important to Blue Shield. Blue Shield can do lots of things, right? We just can't do them all, right? And so not at the same time. And so therefore, what are we focused on? Is it about this cost dimension? Is it really about this innovative care management methodology? Is it about and we will do, of course, many of them, but we just can't do them all, right? And so how do we really understand what's more important and get that business sense of what's going to move the needle the most? Everything matters. Some things matter more than others. That's the bottom line, right? And so how do you partner, come up with that prioritization? So the answer to your question of how do we choose to work on, it's really in partnership with the business. So we're not dreaming up our own solutions by any means. We're really trying to understand what is going to matter the most to the business, what their primary goals are, how do we help accelerate making those goals, and work backwards from that. And so AI and ML is just a methodology to kind of get to those goals, right? You can do some things with the rule-based method. You can do it with a fancy deep learning model. You can do it in lots of different ways. But what are you trying to get to, right? And so, look, I mean, machine learning is not really a new technique. It's only new recently because computational power has gotten to the point, and storage capacity has gotten to the point, and the amount of data available has gotten to the point where you can actually do these things more easily. So the analogy I use when people ask me, what is machine learning? I'll say, imagine you're driving your car down the street. Please write down on a sheet of paper the rule for when you press the brake pedal. And people will say, okay, there's a stop sign coming up, or there's a red light, or the sun was in my eyes, or there was a curve coming up, or somebody I thought was about to cross the street, or it just started to rain. Or the truth is, you can never write down the exact rule for when you press the brake pedal, or the car was next to me was moving towards me, or whatever. But you can do it. You do it successfully, all the time. And how did that happen? That's because your brain takes into account so many more inputs than you could possibly think about consciously at the same time, and has learned that in this set of conditions, now is the right time to press the brake pedal. And in these set of conditions, you don't need to press the brake pedal. And it just learns pattern after pattern after pattern after pattern, and you just get better at it over time. And that is the art of machine learning. Is what are all the pieces of information? And especially if you think of the healthcare ecosystem, there is so much about you. Of course, there is, the visits you went to the doctor, and that's data, but where do you live, and what's the air pollution like where you are, and do you own a bicycle? And they can imagine there's all this data that might be valuable. And in this age of home monitoring that's just exploding, in my opinion, there's going to be even more and more data coming out, right? Yes, it's your Apple Watch and Fitbit, but that's only the beginning. That there is going to be a lot of monitoring of people's health that are coming from home devices, and what are we going to do with all of that information as well, right? And so really trying to think about, and that's where, machine learning can come in and think about, how do I process this massive amount of data and make sense out of it and detect patterns out of it to drive the right outcomes. And so we are, should I recommend this person go to this specialist, yes or no? You can write down some rules. Well, they have, their blood pressure is over this and this and this. And you can write down a few rules, which will work, but may not be as effective as I took into account 50,000 things about you and then made that recommendation. Right? And so that's really where I think a lot of power will come. I think personalized medicine is not that far around the corner, right? Right now, you take a drug, everybody takes the same drug for the same condition. The concept of being personalized in that pharmaceutical, I think, is not that far away, for example, right? And so just really trying to, it all boils down to the same theme that we've been talking about throughout this conversation of understanding people at the individual level is the backbone of a lot of these actions. Right?
All right, so here we are reaching the end, and so I have one final question that I'd like to ask you. So we've spent a lot of this time talking about how data and the data landscape has shifted and changed. So I think, especially given the experience that you have, we know that it's going to change even more in the future, right? We don't know exactly what it's going to be. We can make guesses and estimates, but we just know it will change. Given your experience, though, what has remained the same? What was true for someone that was leading a data-driven organization that was just as true 10 years ago as it is today, and will probably be just as important in 10 more years?
The challenges in the business world have not drastically changed. The how of how to address them has continued to evolve, right? But if you were running a steel business 30 years ago and you're running a steel business today, the problems are pretty much the same, I think, right? And so how do you? But the things you can do to approach their solutions are now different, right? You can now understand things at a velocity that you were not able to understand. You can have an end-to-end view of your supply chain that you couldn't have before. You can make decisions faster and more intelligently, right? And so that is changing, and that is why I think businesses are getting more and more and more productive over time. Like, people keep wondering why the stock market keeps going up, and it generally is going up these days. But that's because businesses are getting more and more productive with doing the same thing, and they're getting better at it, right? They're having fewer defects when they're manufacturing things. They're servicing customers faster. They're doing lots of things are just getting faster and faster, right? And so that, I think, continues over time. Data and analytics, I mean, it's a gold mine. I mean, people say it's the new oil. Maybe it's more like the new sand. I think somebody said that once. It's like sand is everywhere, okay? But it doesn't mean anything unless you actually refine that and turn it into something like something else, right? And so how do we apply it? That is what is remaining constant. It's not about the algorithm. It's like, what are you going to do with it? Like, why would anybody care, right? And there are some cases where you come up with some breakthrough thing that nobody even thought of possible, but largely they have problems they need solved. Work backwards from solving those problems, right? And use data and analytics to do that.
All right. That concludes the interview. Zoher, thank you so much for joining us today. Your data insight and perspective is really valuable. You've given me a lot of different ways to think about this, and I'm sure you have for the listeners as well. And so for the listeners, please visit cdomagazine.tech for any additional interviews you'd like to watch. But most importantly, Zoher, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jake. I appreciate it.